You generally attribute egoity to human beings, but you wonder about everything else. For instance, what about not something relatively inert like a rug, or even just standing there and not seeming to be particularly responsive like a tree? But what about a dog? Is a dog an ego? Do you think dogs are egos when you see them? Just as readily as you think of human beings as egos. So, but why do you draw the line? I mean, how far does it go? Where do you stop thinking of living entities, at least, as egos? Do you just presume everything bigger than a cricket is an ego? Or is everything that moves, from your perspective, experientially, in your natural presumptions, how far does the fact of egoity extend in your presumption?
I don't think size is so much has to do with that. I mean, an ant is...
Well, is an ant an ego in your presumption?
When you say an ego, you mean conscious as itself, as an I, as a separate self? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. The word ego is actually a Greek word, which means I. I consider it with you and talk about it in terms of self-contraction and so forth. So that's the elaboration on its meaning. But the word simply means I, which means the reference, self-reference, the reflexive pronoun, as it's called, of self-reference. So does an ant feel self-referential?
I think so, yes.
You observe them protecting themselves and struggling with others.
Yes.
Couldn't do so without some kind of self-consciousness, could it?
Right.
So you naturally presume that even something like an ant is a self, an ego, self-aware. Does something have to move from its spatial location? Does it have to be able to take a walk, or such as an ant or a human being, or can a tree? Does a tree have self-consciousness?
Yes.
Self-consciousness is itself a kind of egoity by definition. On the other hand, this body exhibits self-consciousness in some sense. I mean, if somebody brought a candle over and held it against my finger, you'd probably see a hand withdrawn to avoid being burned. But that doesn't mean this body is an ego. You see, if you are feeling me, but then you tacitly recognizing me as not being an ego and are moved to me because you identify me as being non-egoic and yet present, and even present in a apparently normal and natural human form. Normal in the sense of 2 arms, 2 legs, all the usual look, basic look of a human being, and speaking now. So it qualifies more or less as a normal human being, just on the sight of it, you see. But feeling me, you feel, if you recognize me, you feel beyond that. That's not the message coming through this. What about trees? They are entities with apparent self-consciousness of a kind. They are, in that sense, egos. But are they egoic? Are they functioning egoically? Are their reactions and all that any different than this body moving its hand away from a flame? In other words, are they messed up about it? Are they feeling that they are in bondage and moved to seek as human beings are? As you feel in your own case. You see, you're not just growing there. You are troubled there, motivated always to something perhaps not identifiable all the time, but sometimes identifiable through desires and thinking and puzzling over things. And so in some sense, you're not in a fixed position just quietly growing. You are more noisily upset about being here to begin with. Trees don't seem to behave, generally speaking, quite that way. They are self-conscious as organisms, but they don't seem to be particularly disturbed about being trees. On the face of it, just looking at trees, that's what people like walking through a forest. The trees don't feel like they're messed up about it. Standing around, and there you go, to go for walks through Muir Woods or the redwoods up near Trinidad and so forth. The trees, generally speaking, were not disturbed. Sometimes things happen to trees and they exhibit disturbance. They fall over or get injured, and they do something about it, or they die, or whatever. So there is that kind of thing. But otherwise, standing around in the forest, they don't seem to have any disposition that suggests they are disturbed about being alive there. They seem more characterized by some kind of contemplation in which they don't feel disturbed. And you can see that also sometimes in non-humans of various kinds. I've spoken of this in the past on a number of occasions. In fact, that's why I've established Fear No More Zoo. One of the reasons is so that human beings can observe and feel what non-humans do in a self-conscious situation. There's that much likeness between a human being and a chameleon or a bird or a camel or whatever. And obviously they sometimes become disturbed. But there's also a kind of contemplation sign that you frequently see the non-humans engaging in. And they do it a lot more often than human beings generally do, unless they take on a discipline of contemplation and use some of their time to do that. A lot of people never seem to do anything even remotely like contemplation. But if you observe non-humans, virtually all of them show signs of setting themselves apart and entering into a contemplative state that resembles some kind of a samadhi or meditative condition. And One of the places you tend not to see them do this very much, or you see them do it less, are in circumstances of confinement, such as zoos as they have been traditionally, or perhaps circuses that are not, especially when they're not run properly, where the animals are not treated properly, where animals lose their freedom of motion and relatedness in the natural order of their own pattern, natural pattern. They become less contemplative and more disturbed. And if you put a lion in a circus train car, with the bars on and all the rest, they just walk back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. They never stop, it seems. So they lie down every now and then, of course, but they are disturbed by it. They become neurotic. They exhibit more of what human beings can identify as their own state of egoity. Why do you think human beings are disturbed? See, why is human egoity what it is? If you observe how it appears in evidence in non-humans, it suggests that human beings are the way they are because they're confined. And not just confined by walls and bars. Some people are. And they get very disturbed there and walk back and forth or get kind of catatonic or whatever, their reaction. But they certainly get disturbed when they can't move freely and associate freely and engage in the patterns that they are habituated to. It's torment, is it? To be isolated from other human beings is a kind of torture, unless you embrace it as a discipline and deal with the reaction. And that's what solitaries have to do. So human egoity is a characteristic of observed otherwise in non-humans when non-humans are confined. And yet human beings exhibit this even when they're not in any circumstance that you might call confinement. It doesn't look evidently like confinement. You can be on vacation on Waikiki Beach, you see, and look like you're having a swell time with your drink with the umbrella in it, laughing, and it's paradise, you see. And yet, if you really observe people under those circumstances, they're still exhibiting forms of disturbance. And what happens when they leave the beach? What happens when they leave Waikiki? What happens when they leave Hawaii or whatever? See, if you see them in their lifespan, they are disturbed. They're always confined, and yet acting as if confined, even when they're not apparently confined. So what's confining? That's the self-contraction. It's not the mere fact of the organism, it's the self-contraction of the organism that is the critical nature of egoity, operative in human beings, in which I am addressing in the case of all devotees or anyone considered my teaching. Your bondage is your own activity. And it also extends from conditions. Conditions can reinforce or seem to justify self-contraction. But still what you're suffering is self-contraction itself. So it's not just the natural act of self-reference, which would occur even in the case of an enlightened personality. You see, there's still the convention of eye reference meant as a convention, and the body, generally speaking, will still react to a flame on their hand or whatever, you see. Like trees, but they are not in their nature or disposition or root place self-contracted, at least in the case of ultimate realization. Others may be very relaxed. Not quite absolutized, still conditionally dependent. But nonetheless, there's still something exhibited by people of some kind of or degree of spiritual maturity, that there's at least a relaxation of modes of self-contraction. They don't exist in the presumption of confinement quite as ordinary human beings do. So human beings are actually confined, and they are self-confined. And otherwise also living in varying modes and degrees of confinement by conditions of life. And in fact, human beings feel confined by bodily existence, because however healthy you may be at the moment, you know you're going to die. And are, potentially you could suffer any number of grave happenings, and you anticipate that inevitably you will, sooner or later, experience some fundamental difficulties that you would prefer not to have to endure, including disease and death.
But don't trees, for example, have that?
Well, everything that's physically living is going to die. The difference is, does it drive you crazy? Make you sick? Or are you at ease because you haven't lost touch with what transcends that possibility?